This is Lisa from Mobile Tech Review, and it's time for Tech for Artists. This time it's the Huion Kamvas, K-A-M-V-A-S, Pro 22. We reviewed the previous version of this, is also otherwise known as the GT-221, well, this one is the V2. And what's different particularly about this is the display has improved a little bit. The etching on the glass, it looks better than it did before. It's a little bit brighter. And also we finally have a battery-less pen. So before you had to plug in a little USB cable, you know, every several months or so to recharge a pen, you don't have to do that anymore. Also, they say that the pen supports tilt. Well, you have to actually ask for the firmware to enable that, and I got it, and I wasn't able to get that working. It actually didn't recognize the device, so it's still working on that. But since this uses Windows Ink, much like Cintiq does on Surface Pro or Wacom AES, my bet is programs like Photoshop and stuff still aren't going to be supporting tilt on this. Some others might. Anyway, we're going to look at it now. So Huion, like XP Pen and Uji, we've reviewed them all. They make basically affordable alternatives to the Wacom Cintiq line of pen displays. These are otherwise known as the Chinese clones. They're not really clones, though, of Wacom products. They do their own thing, and they do it pretty well for a lot less money. Of course, there are reasons for that. We're going to talk at the end of this about what more you're going to get if you get something like the new Wacom Cintiq Pro 24. So this is about $900 on Amazon, so that sounds like a lot of money, but when you talk about a Wacom Cintiq Pro 24 costing around $2,000 starting price, well, then it starts to sound like, hey, what a deal. So this is a 21.5 inch, they call it 22-inch display. It's a full HD 1920 by 1080 resolution display with IPS-like technology inside, so the viewing angles on this are quite good. They claim 99% of sRGB coverage, and it almost is there. It's at about 95% or so. We'll show you the color metrics. So that's a pretty good start. And the fact that this is etched glass instead of some kludged-on, low-quality matte screen protector is good, because number one, it's not going to wear out the way a screen protector would. And God knows if you try to replace it and put one on yourself, the bubbles on something this big would be pretty annoying. And the pen supports 8,192 levels of pressure, so that's as good as it gets in terms of the number of pressure levels. In terms of the pressure curves on this, you can adjust it using the application, the driver that comes with this, and it takes more pressure than something like a Wacom Cintiq would or a Wacom EMR in general, but it's not too bad. It's something you can adjust. I can always adjust my hand pressure, so as long as the curves are pretty linear, it's a good thing. As with all these Chinese pen displays, there is no touchscreen option, so you get the active pen and that's all. Now in the box you get a lot of stuff. That's a good point. You get all the cables you might need. This has connectors for HDMI, which probably most of you are going to use. There's also DVI and good old-fashioned VGA, and it uses a USB cable for the actual pen data to transmit. So you got both the display cable and you have the USB cable to transmit the pen data. It's compatible with both Mac and Windows. They have drivers for both, and you know, it used to be that this kind of display, the drivers were a little bit nightmarish at times. They have improved a lot over the couple of years that I've been reviewing them now, and I really haven't had any problems with them. The only problem I had was with the firmware updater not actually finding the display to update the firmware to support tilt. But the driver itself works, and it has the features that you would expect, where you can adjust your pressure curves, that sort of thing, and you can program what Wacom would call express keys. These keys all along the side, including a touch slider control. And these mirror the function on each side. So basically you program the functions on one strip and it gets mirrored on the other side. So it's left-handed friendly in that way, but don't think you can make this button over here do something different from the one exactly opposite. They do the same thing. So that's enough keys for your undo, for your brush switching, all that sort of thing. You can program the scrolly thing right here to do zooming, for example, and obviates the need for a touchscreen maybe. I find that I kind of like not having a touchscreen on these products because honestly I don't have to worry about accidental hand touches activating the screen and doing something I didn't intend anyway. Let's talk parallax. That's where you put the pen tip, physically the nib of the pen on the screen, where it appears on the screen itself. Well, they've improved that a lot too, and it's pretty good. The only weird thing is out of the box it was pretty good. And when I went through the calibration, the usual touch each corner in the middle of the screen kind of thing, it actually got worse. So I put it back to the factory default and it worked fine. I don't know if it just doesn't get along with left-handed people like me, or if it's just you better just leave it at the factory default. So anyway, the pen tip shows up pretty close to where you think it will on screen. So yes, we rely on the brush cursor and all that sort of thing in our programs, but still it's nice when there's not a big disconnect there. So another good thing is we've seen a few displays where the connectors for your cables actually face downwards, so they fight with the desk as you tilt the thing up and down. The connectors are all on the side with this, so you won't have that problem. And yes, the stand is included, screws on the back. You could use a ergo mount on it instead if you wanted to, but it's always good the fact that these guys come with a stand. It's adjustable, infinite positions, and it's sturdy enough, it's robust. I'm pretty happy with it. And gosh, Wacom charges a lot more money for something like that, don't they? The one thing it won't do that a Wacom does, though, is there's no rotating it to portrait mode. This is just forward, backward tilt. So this is not going to set the world on fire exactly, but they have a new pen stand. They're always changing design. So now we have the donut style pen stand. It's fine. It works. It does the job. And like with all of these, you unscrew it and you have access to the spare nibs. They give you 10 spare nibs and a nib puller. Now these are 10 identical nibs. So this is not like a Wacom Cintiq where you can get a felt nib or all different sort of feels, and even Microsoft Surface, they offer a couple of different kinds of nibs. So 10 identical nibs. And it does make a little bit of a sound on the glass when you're drawing because of the etch screen, I guess, against the fairly hard tip. So before we get into the drawing experience, let's talk about the quality of the display itself. These do get better over the years, I'll say that, but they're not up there where I would like them to be. For color gamma, it's not bad. You can see the metrics on screen, and we have 95% of sRGB and 76% of Adobe RGB. That's pretty decent, and what you would expect to see in around $800, $900 laptop if you were buying one of those. The contrast ratio on this is abysmal. The black levels are frighteningly bad. Honestly, you just don't see black levels that bad. Little lower numbers are better for black levels. So usually you see like 0.33, which means that there's not much light. You're mostly seeing black there. So when you see something over 1.0, whoa. So one thing about this says DCR, like a lot of monitors do, particularly these pen displays. That stands for Dynamic Contrast Ratio Mode. It is not turned on by default. Go into the settings. You hit the menu button on the top of the screen to get into the settings and turn it on immediately. Now, with some of the previous models we reviewed, what that did was it kind of looked nice, but it blew out the color accuracy and it crushed blacks and all that sort of thing. In this case, the metrics actually improved. We tested with our Spider 5 colorimeter, piece of hardware that measures the display characteristics, and the contrast got noticeably better on this. The brightness actually went up on it, so significantly at that, and the black levels improved. So do turn that on and you'll have a much nicer looking display. Out of the box from the factory, otherwise, the calibration is pretty off. It veers towards the green, which is unfortunate because a lot of people like a display that veers toward the blue. It looks cool, literally cool color, and things look very stark and sharp. But green tends to make things look like they are lacking in contrast, and this monitor already is lacking in contrast, perhaps in part because of the etched glass on top of it, who knows. Anyway, calibrate it if you can, or eyeball it to improve it. It has its own color settings. You can use those, or you can use Windows color settings to work on that. If you do that, enable dynamic contrast ratio and do your best to calibrate the display, it's not really very bad looking. We have it set up next to a Razer Blade 15 laptop, which has their better 1080p panel option here. And you know, the Razer Blade certainly looks better, and the contrast is obviously better. The blacks are much more detailed. So what that means for a lot of these pen monitors, or most all of them that are not the more expensive Wacom Cintiqs, is if you're looking for the necessary contrast ratio, the color gamut, the accurate calibration for photo editing, not so much. This is really for people who are doing art. You're doing drawing, whether it's Clip Studio Paint or Photoshop or Illustrator, whatever your drawing kind of activity is. It's better for that sort of thing. Now, one way that you can deal with that also, obviously, is if you do have it hooked up to a laptop with a better display, or you have a second monitor hooked up, you can actually take your artwork and move it over to the other screen so you can eyeball it for contrast and color and all that sort of thing. Like I said, the colors will be pretty accurate on this, though. It's mostly the contrast that will throw you off. Viewing angles are pretty good on this, and that counts because this is a display that tilts back pretty far and moves up, so you actually don't want to see a whole lot of shifting going on. It's good for that. So what about the drawing experience? I've tested it with Clip Studio Paint, with Sketchable, with Adobe Photoshop, which is a lot of pros are using these days to draw in, and it does the job just fine, and the pressure levels work just fine in all of those. It's not as buttery and smooth as Wacom EMR, but it feels a lot more accurate and a lot more responsive than, say, what you'll get with a Surface product these days, I hate to say. N-Trig still isn't quite up there. What I mean is the pressure curves on this are really very nice, and if you're doing a circle, it's going to look just fine. If you're doing lines that taper. You'll get the proper taper, say you're going from heavy pressure to light pressure. You'll get a nice taper at the end of your line where you're using less pressure. There's no fishhooks here, and the jitter is pretty well controlled too. There's just a little bit of it when you draw really slow diagonal lines, which is a popular test, so I'm not sure how many of us do that, but the reason we do that test is because there are times when you are drawing slowly to be very careful, and you don't want line wobble introduced by the system that your hand is not doing. So I do like the drawing experience pretty well overall. So what are you getting if you spend twice as much money or more and you go with a Wacom Cintiq Pro 24-inch model? Well, you're going to get a 4K display instead of a 1080p display, so significantly higher resolution, much wider color gamut, much better contrast. The Cintiq is really a very high-end display, and it looks like it. It too has an etched glass finish, but it doesn't reduce the overall contrast nearly as much as the finish on this seems to. Again, with the Ergo stand, if you were going to spend that $500 extra for the Wacom, you could rotate into portrait mode and all that sort of thing. I'm not sure that's a big selling point. You probably want to use an Ergotron arm anyway with one of these things. For those of you who want a touch screen, again, that's an option with the Wacom Cintiq line, but not here. Lastly, I don't think this is so important, but for those of you who do have newer computers that have USB-C, whether it's a MacBook Pro or it's a Windows machine, Wacom has a single cable solution. You can still use USB cables and HDMI cables or DisplayPort cables if you want with the Wacom Cintiq, but they also have the USB-C cable in the box. So single cable handles what both the USB and the display cable would handle. And the drivers, that's the last thing. I mean, these drivers for all of these products can be a little troublesome at times, but generally speaking, Wacom's drivers are more bulletproof than what you're going to get with one of these. Fewer bugs, fewer gotchas, but you know, they'll still happen. And they also are very full-featured in terms of what you can do with the driver and the settings and the per application settings, even with the Wacom Cintiq. So you can have different settings for Photoshop versus Blender and all that sort of thing. So that's the Huion Kamvas Pro 22, and it's certainly their best pen display yet. And it's a pleasure to draw on this. The little squeaky sounds that you get are a little bit annoying. The lack of tilt, well, maybe we'll get that working. That would be pretty exciting if we can get that working. But overall, the marks that you can make with this, the quality of the inking experience is very good. It takes a little bit of a heavier touch than I might prefer, but that is adjustable, so you can get around that pretty well. The quality of the display, it might not be perfect, but it is getting better certainly than previous generations as well, and it's half the price of a Wacom Cintiq Pro, so that's pretty fair. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more cool tech videos, including Tech for Artists, and thumbs up if you like this vid.